First up, I've got a film called Him. This is about a young up-and-coming quarterback. He is on the verge of going pro, and he gets the opportunity to train with the current best quarterback there is. The young quarterback is played by Tyreek Withers, and the MVP GOAT character is played by Marlon Wayans. And oh man, I really wanted to like this film. I want to give a tip of the cap to the trailer editor, who I think managed to make it look more interesting than it ended up being. And it's a shame because I do think there were interesting themes that they were starting to explore, but I don't think they were able to commit tonally. I think the script needed work, and as a byproduct of both of those things and just not knowing where it wanted to go, it kind of falls apart somewhere between almost like the halfway point or maybe technically the third act, which is a real shame. You know, no shade to any of the actors involved. I think Tyreek Withers and Marlon Wayans give really strong performances. And I do think, like I said, some of the themes that it's trying to explore are interesting. You know, Marlon Wayans' character being this person who has achieved, you know, greatness to a level and not wanting to fall into irrelevance and, you know, grappling with like, should I retire? There's also this new young person kind of nipping at my heels. Tyreek Withers' character, who has, you know, been told from the very beginning, like, you are the prodigal son of football, basically. You know, you are next in line, and having to reckon with, like, is this something that he wants? Is this something he has been told his whole life? You know, the internal versus external motivation stuff. It's all simmering at the surface, but it never really gets to a boil. And I will caveat, you know, I didn't play football. I didn't play team sports in the same way other folks did. You know, I was on teams, but it was mostly about individual performance and that type of thing. So I think if you were especially a football player, there will be an extra layer of appreciation you'll have for this. You know, I think anybody who comes from an athletic background will understand the whole pushing yourself and sacrifice and, you know, the inherent, like, in a lot of scenarios, there's a winner and a loser, and just the competitive nature of it, like that, I think is generally there. It's just the rest of it gets mushy. And I think, you know, they were trying to decide, do we want to go with this horror element? And I know Jordan Peele is listed as a producer, and I would just like to remind folks that just because somebody's a producer does not mean they're necessarily creatively involved deeply in a project. And I respect folks like Jordan Peele is somebody who does this a lot. Guillermo del Toro does this a lot, where they'll lend their name to a project to kind of help boost it and get more people to see it. And I don't think there's a problem with that, but I think you should temper your expectations when you see, you know, from producer versus like directed by or written by. And I think the writing is where this sort of all starts to fall apart. You know, a lot of the dialogue, you can tell some of the dialogue has been ADR'd in to kind of be like, oh, we really got to hammer this point home. And I don't know if the audience is going to pick up on it. It's like, we picked up on it. It's just not coming to a culmination of something that ends up being particularly interesting. I think if they committed, like I said, I'm trying to dance around spoilers. If they committed tonally one way or another, I think this would have been a stronger case. You know, there's also a kind of a religious, or not even kind of, there's a religious aspect and undertone to it, you know, which is, again, in the trailers. I personally didn't really relate to that. And I think they also kind of shied away from it. Or maybe, ironically, this is one of the few departments where they expected an audience to have a background in this and were kind of reliant upon people reading in more to it. But then they'll default to these expository conversations where they're like, panic, just in case, let's spoon feed this to you. And I'm really bummed because I think it had a lot going for it. I think if it had just potentially committed to being like a straightforward tale of, you know, how far are you willing to go and the kind of power battle between new and the old athletes for a franchise, like, great, that would have been fine. I think they overcomplicated it for themselves. The rest of the cast is rounded out by Julia Fox, who I don't want to say was unrecognizable, but I was like, who is that? And then Tim Heidecker and Jim Jeffries. And I did not recognize Jim Jeffries, who's an Australian comedian. In this, I was like, who is this guy? And poor Jim Jeffries keeps being given a lot of the monologues that are just like fill in the blank parts. I'm like, what is happening here? And maybe this is a byproduct of the Jordan Peele effect, where it's like, bring in comedians to serious, scary movies. But then again, Marlon Wayans, you don't always think of as a dramatic actor. And like I said, no fault lies with the actors in this. You know, again, I think because I saw so much potential in it, that is why I'm really bummed that I can't strongly recommend this film. You know, if this was just the first half of the movie, I'd be like, yeah, go see it. But unfortunately, the second half is there. And the second half is where it really falls apart. This is not one that I would particularly recommend to folks. I think maybe if you want to wait for it to come out on home entertainment, that might be fine. But this isn't a rush out and see it in the theaters film. You know, and some of the visuals, really impressive. I think the sound design is good. It's just such a shame that if you don't have a good story and a good script, no amount of these other factors will compensate for that. I'm only going to give this a 2.8 out of 5. The next thing I have is the second season of Gen V. This is the spinoff of The Boys. It takes place at Godolphin University, and it's about this sort of younger set of superheroes who, a little bit thematically with him, you know, it's about the rankings and, you know, how good you are and the public measurement of you and all that stuff. I remember watching season 1, but I didn't remember a ton of what happened in season 1, and I'm not gonna lie, it's been a moment since I watched the last season of The Boys, so I couldn't quite remember where we were plot-wise, but the good thing is they do a really good job with their catch-ups, so you don't have to rewatch everything going into this. You do need to at some point have seen season 1 of Gen V and be caught up on The Boys in order for this season plot-wise to make sense, although I think the thing I like about Gen V is that even though they built this massive lore in the wider Boys universe, this is just a tiny bit more contained, and so even though I might not remember every finite detail, the interpersonal relationships between the characters are actually a really great way to pick up the larger kind of political situation that's happening. They'll bring stuff up, and it is more elegant than the way, let's say, something like Him drops a dialogue bomb on you. Jazz Sinclair, Lizzie Broadway, Asa German, London Thor, Derek Liu, Maddie Phillips, and Sean Patrick Thomas are back, and this time Hamish Linklater joins them as the new dean of the school, and he is such a good actor. He is very terrifying in this, and I think one of the other fun things about The Boys and Gen V is that, like, you can have these characters who are effectively smarter than everyone else because they are superheroes or they have superhuman whatever, and they play it so down to earth and underplay it a lot of the time. And I think it really elevates the series. And even though it is very violent and gross and also fun and ridiculous sometimes, like, it still keeps things grounded in a really impressive way without going into spoilers. This season is probably going to be very important in leading into the next season of The Boys, so worth a watch for that alone. If you are not a fan of these franchises, this is certainly not where you're going to start. But if you were someone who was only watching The Boys and skipped Gen V because you were like, oh, I don't particularly care, I don't see the relevance of this, I highly recommend checking out both seasons. The next thing I have this week is called Swiped, and it is about Whitney Wolfe, who was effectively one of the founders of Tinder and is definitely the founder of Bumble. And unfortunately, I think there's a couple things working against this film. You know, I think if this film had come out at least 5 years ago, the tech founder biopic space would have been a little less saturated. And it's kind of a bummer to say because she is one of the few female founders who, I guess, positively founded a company versus like a scandal like the Elizabeth Holmes story. But I think there's a few things going. So one, the space is oversaturated. Two, you know, the character herself is not that compelling. You know, yes, she was there at the right time. She had great ideas. She was in a boys club and was treated like garbage by the boys and couldn't say anything about it at the time. I mean, technically, she can't even say anything about it now because there were lawsuits and all this other stuff. But as a person, like, Whitney Wolfe was just a right place, right time person. And the film also tries to acknowledge her inherent privilege, but it comes very late at the end and it comes in a very monologue-y way. And if you can't tell this week, I'm very against the kind of expository monologue. But yeah, so, you know, I think if she had been more interesting and if the story itself is interesting and it's also not, right? So, you know, again, she was one of the founders of Tinder, but the three dudes who founded it with her kind of told her to her face she was a founder and then absolutely didn't treat her like one and publicly wouldn't acknowledge it. And then again, lawsuits. And then she was dating one of them and that turned horrific. And the film does a fine job of conveying the nightmare that is being a woman in tech and the nightmare that probably is being a woman in leadership and all this stuff. But there is just something a little bit off about it. And I think there's also some of like the way that the character reacts in the portrayal. I'm not victim blaming here, don't get me wrong, but I think the portrayal of it, and the portrayal I should note is by Lily James, who I think is a fine actress. The portrayal by Lily James, like, there is just this weird cognitive dissonance between what she is trying to convey and what I think is actually being conveyed. And as a byproduct, like, I think it is a bit alienating, but I also have to kind of objectively evaluate as a film, where does this stand? And as a film, it's not very good. You know, again, if this had been earlier to market, I think it would have been more interesting. I think the script needed work. I think the self-aggrandizing of like what Bumble accomplished, I'm like, it's just a dating app, y'all. And ironically, this is also why I think it coming out now is different than if it had come out 5 years ago. The whole point of Bumble as a dating app was like, oh, women are empowered. Women have to match first. All this other stuff. Now Bumble is more or less like every other mobile-based dating app out there. So it's like, okay, well, you've kind of done away with everything that made it sort of unique. So like, where's your leg to stand on here? Like I said, as a film, not particularly interesting. I think this would have been more interesting as, and I'm sure there are articles out there telling the story of the founder. It could have just been consolidated down to one really well-written expose, which is a bummer to say, but I just have to be fair to it. I am only going to give this a 2 out of 5, and that is honestly probably being generous. The last thing I have this week is just a brief shout out to a new documentary called Rebel Royals, An Unlikely Love Story. It is out on Netflix, and I knew absolutely nothing about this story, which is why it was interesting to me. I think if you'd been following along, you don't necessarily need this doc. It's very much from the perspective of the participants, so it is very subjective. It is about Princess Martha Louise of Norway, who married a shaman named Durek Verrett. He is a black man marrying into a very white family. He is an American marrying into a Norwegian royal family. He is also someone who, to use his words in it, thought he would have married a man. So fascinating from that point of view. Love is love. Do your thing. Are you going to ask a lot of questions while watching it? Yeah, probably. Does the film care? No, not necessarily. But there are just a lot of twists and turns in this that I found entertaining. Could you watch this in the background? Absolutely. Is it going to enhance your life from an academic standpoint? No, not necessarily. But was it just kind of fun and soap opera-y? Yeah, it really was. Like I said, if you were unfamiliar with the story, this will likely be entertaining. Take it with a huge grain of salt because it is very clearly just from their point of view and is not necessarily interested in asking questions about, their intentions and motivations, etc. It's almost like a propaganda piece. But at the same time, it is at least willing to air a tiny bit of the dirty laundry about Shaman Durek Verrett. So I give them credit in that sense, I suppose. But yeah, just putting on your radar, Rebel Royals, an unlikely love story.